you have anything to take up prior to allowing Ms. Riggs to resume her cross-examination of Janet Thornton?
Your Honor, I would just say that we will be delivering to the court, to Mr. Steele momentarily, a written response to the motion that the plaintiffs filed this morning.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure he will forward that on to us. In fact, let me check here just a second. We may have already gotten it. Let me see.
Yes, I see it happened 3 minutes ago.
That we received it?
Well, that Mr. Steele received it, and as
Yeah.
did the lawyers, yes.
Okay, yes, he emailed it to us that we just now got the email, so.
Okay,
Yep.
great.
All right. All right. Then, look, did I hear somebody there? Okay, great. We can go ahead and let Ms. Thornton into the courtroom. Ms. Thornton, can you hear me okay? Ms. Thornton?
Yes.
Okay, great. I can hear you as well. Are you ready to resume your testimony?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Okay, great. Then, Ms. Riggs, I will allow you to ask your next question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Thornton. Welcome back. Right when we ended before lunch, we were nearly wrapping up a discussion of factors correlating to race, and we were talking about geographic mobility. Before closing that, I just want to be clear that you have no data to suggest that any specific voter on Professor Quinn's no match list has moved out of state, correct?
I don't not know for certain. Upon reviewing some of them, there are some that appear to be highly likely to have moved out of state.
Sitting here today, you can't name any of those voters, correct?
No.
And it
No,
was
but I said, testified in reviewing the data, there are some who appear to be highly likely.
okay. And you didn't list those voters on the no match list in your report, correct?
No, I did not.
Okay. So sitting here today, there's nothing you can point the court to as far as a specific voter on Professor Quinn's no match list who may have voted out of state, correct?
Who may have voted out of state.
Sorry, moved out of state, if I said that incorrectly.
Other than the information contained in my report, I haven't named a specific individual.
Poverty is a factor correlated with race that may influence why an individual is on the no match list. Isn't that correct?
I don't know.
Poverty is a factor correlated with race that may influence why an individual may lack photo identification. Isn't that correct?
I don't know.
Okay. You understand, don't you, that African Americans are more likely to live in poverty than white voters in North Carolina, don't you?
I understand the poverty rate to be higher among African Americans, yes.
And Dr. Thornton, you'd agree with me that obtaining an ID requires expenditure of some resources in terms of time, correct?
Sure.
And you'd agree with me that obtaining an ID could also take transportation costs, correct?
It may or may not.
It's possible.
It's possible.
On direct, you testified that you believed the addition of school, agency, and county board issued free IDs reduced the racial disparity in ID possession compared to what was measured in House Bill 589. Did I understand that correctly?
I testified that the addition of government employee IDs and the addition of college IDs, based on the demographic data of those two populations, would be expected to lower the estimated gap. And the numbers did go down.
Okay, so if I understand your clarification there, you're saying you're not testifying that that was the causal factor in any difference in numbers between 2015 and 2019?
We know that the numbers went down, and we know that there's the addition of those two forms of ID. And we know that they contributed to the matches. So beyond that, yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Dr. Thornton, you broke up on your last sentence and I could not understand you.
Oh dear. Trying to recall what I said. That we know that the change was in part those two additional forms of ID, and we know that the numbers went down between 2015 and 2020, and we know that they contributed to the matches. And beyond that, I do not have anything more to add.
Okay. I'd like to publish plaintiff's demonstrative marked PDX 4-11. This is a bar graph representing table 6 in Professor Quinn's expert report. Here, I think this is what you're referring to about the additional matches from the agency IDs and the additional matches from the school IDs. Is that correct?
I don't know. I haven't seen this demonstrative, so I don't know.
Okay. Do you recall from Dr. Quinn's expert report at table 6 that he disclosed the number of new additions, new matches from the quote unquote free IDs, agency IDs, and school IDs?
I do not recall the exact numbers. What I don't know is this is, as I understand, additive, if I recall, rather than looking at it what would the additional IDs have been but for? And I don't know that answer to that question. What we can see is we have the additional IDs here, which there's a little less than 50,000. And we know that the number for African Americans went down from 140,000 down to 144,000. That we know.
Okay, well, I will represent to you that the
Excuse me, Ms. Higgs. I'm sorry, but those numbers completely broke up on my audio and I can't read them from where I'm sitting. So I need to have that answer back. It says we can see is we have the additional IDs here, which there's a little under 50,000. We know that the number from the African Americans went down from, and I couldn't hear the rest. I think it's because you're turned away from your microphone, to be honest.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm trying to see. I moved so that I can see a bigger screen because I can't see. But let me move this. See if this will work. I believe I testified, and then we know that the number of African Americans among the no matches went from 140,000 down to 114,000.
All right. Dr. Thornton, I will represent to you for the record that this demonstrative is pulled from Dr. Quinn's expert report, JX5, at page 13 for the quote-unquote free IDs, paragraph 115, page 13, paragraph 45 for the Board of Election IDs, page 38, paragraph 115 for agency IDs, and page 38, paragraph 115 for the school IDs. First, Dr. Thornton, you're not asserting right now that the change in number of African Americans on the no match list from 2019 to 2015 is the result of these additional IDs all being obtained by African American voters, are you?
No, I'm not.
Okay. And on direct, you testified, oh, I'm sorry, no, strike that. You did not analyze the racial composition of voters who possess these new forms of qualifying ID, did you?
No, I did not.
So you didn't analyze the racial composition of the 205 additional matches that Professor Quinn identified using the Board of Elections IDs?
No.
And you did not analyze the racial composition of the 1,819 additional matches Professor Quinn identified using agency IDs, correct?
That's correct.
And you did not analyze the racial composition of the 44,422 additional matches Professor Quinn identified using student IDs, correct?
That is correct.
So you have not actually analyzed the extent to which these new forms of qualifying ID affect the racial disparity in ID possession, isn't that right?
I did not specifically look at that question. What I looked at was with the addition of the data, what was the overall disparity?
Right, and I'm sorry, please finish.
I finished.
Okay. I understand, but my question was specifically, you haven't actually analyzed the extent to which these new forms of qualifying ID affect the racial disparity in ID possession, correct?
I haven't looked at that specific question.
I'd like to turn now to ask you some questions regarding the scope of the work you performed in this case. Dr. Thornton, you'd agree that you did not conduct a beginning to end matching analysis in this case, right?
That is correct.
You started from Professor Quinn's data set of no matches and went from there, right?
That is correct.
And likewise, you did not perform a matching analysis independent of your critique of plaintiffs' experts in the House Bill 589 litigation either, is that right?
That is correct.
You submitted a report during the preliminary injunction stage of this case in around June of 2019, is that right?
That's correct.
And since that time, you would have had time to perform a beginning to end matching analysis if you'd been asked to do so, correct?
If I had the time, yes.
I'm saying since June 2019, if you'd been asked to do that, you would have had time, correct?
If I had time.
I don't understand that answer.
In other words, if I had nothing else to do, I'm on my schedule.
All right.
I do not, I don't sit around idly.
I certainly wasn't suggesting so. And you made your counsel aware of the forms of ID that you would ideally like to have data on to conduct a beginning to end no match analysis. Isn't that right?
I identified the types of data that would be perhaps useful to defendants counsel.
You performed additional matching based on the data provided from Professor Quinn's matching analysis using some data from the DMV. Do I understand that correctly?
I used all of the data files that I received as well as Dr. Quinn received from the
Okay. And to identify new matches, you had the assistance of 2 research assistants, right?
I believe so.
You don't recall?
Well, you're asking me, I would have had computer programmers who would have assisted me with it, the program,
2 of them, correct?
as I recall.
Your work was limited in that you did not check for any false positives in Professor Quinn's analysis or cases where he identified a match where a voter did not actually possess qualifying ID, correct?
Well, among those that I matched, I did look at the matches. And with regards to false positives, as I believe I testified about, is that the percentage uniqueness factor is 99% or higher than 99%. Consequently, as I believe Dr. Quinn testified, the odds of a false positive are very, very small. Among those matches that I prepared, I did look at them.
Okay, so I think my question was different. You did not look to see whether there were any false positives in Professor Quinn's matches, did you?
Not specifically for the very reason that the odds of a false positive are very small.
Right. And you told me at deposition, though, that you agreed that there were likely false positives even when match strings were used that were highly unique, correct?
Yeah, I said there will be the possibility, but the odds are substantially or significantly diminished, as Dr. Quinn also testified, because of the uniqueness factor.
You employed different forms of manual review to look for false negatives, correct?
Yes, and among mine false positives when I matched.
And a manual review introduces human error or subjectivity into a matching analysis, correct?
Based on experience, I would say it's not so much subjectivity as it is experience. And one takes the manual review and then can systematically review the data as I did.
Is it your testimony today, Professor Thornton, that performing manual review does not introduce human error into an analysis?
It depends on what you're talking about in terms of human error.
Professor
And-
Quinn, do you remember? I'm sorry, go ahead. Finish.
Just to clarify for the court, I'm not a professor.
I'm sorry. Were you finished answering the question?
I believe so.
Okay. Dr. Thornton, did you have your deposition taken in this case?
Yes, I did.
And it was sworn under oath?
Yes.
And your attorney was there with you?
Counsel for the defendant was present.
Okay. Could we put up Dr. Thornton's deposition transcript. And at page 28, lines 3 through 12. Dr. Thornton, I asked you about manual review, and you said it would be impossible to check for false positives unless you did it all manually. I said, okay, and then you answered, and then you would have human error. Did you state that in your deposition, Dr. Thornton?
Yes.
You can take
I
that.
object, Your Honor. I don't think she read the quote exactly.
The objection's overruled.
Ashley, you may take that down. Thank you.
May I?
Your attorney can ask you questions on redirect if you'd like, Dr. Thornton. In all your work that you did in this case, you did not use any form of random sampling technique in your manual review of Professor Quinn's matching analysis, did you?
No.
And in statistics, random sampling is useful because it ensures that the cases one examines are representative of the broader population of interest. Isn't that true?
Well, you can do a random sample. You can also look at everything in its entirety, which would be 100% coverage. So, you know, it depends on how you're looking at the question.
Okay, but as I stated the question, it's true, isn't it, that in statistics, random sampling is useful because it ensures that the cases one examines are representative of the broader population of interest, correct?
Yes, that is what random sampling does. However, if you look at 100% of the population, then that is a 100% complete. It's not random, it's the entire population, which you can also do.
Okay. You had access to the North Carolina voter file, correct?
Yes,
And there are millions of records in that voter file, correct?
yes,
And there are millions of records in the qualifying ID databases Professor Quinn used for matching, right?
yes,
You've testified today about the records which you argue are erroneously on Professor Quinn's no match list. You did not conduct a systematic review of the no match list. Isn't that right?
but depend on what you want to refer to as systematic.
Dr. Quinn, do you remember in your deposition, I asked you the question, do you have any voter record files you can point to as being erroneously on the no match list because of a slight difference in birth date?
I believe I answered that. I did not mention, I did not identify them. I believe I talked about that in my report.
Okay. And do you recall saying that you couldn't do that because you didn't look at those systematically? I'd be happy to pull up your deposition transcript if it would help you refresh your recollection.
I probably did, so I'm not disputing it, but to your earlier question, you asked me about systematically, and the question is, in my mind is, are there things that I did look at systematically? And the answer is yes.
You did not look at every single one of the files on Dr. Quinn's no match list, did you?
If you're asking me if I did not look at line by line, is that the question?
Yes, of the 480,000 records, you did not examine them one by one manually, correct?
I did not examine them one by one. I looked for patterns and then systematically looked at the patterns.
And you're not offering the court a number or estimate of the number of false negatives on Professor Quinn's no match list, are you?
In my report, I give some information about possible numbers. So for example, Cumberland County, where you have Fort Bragg, has a disproportionate number of the no matches. So I've provided information about those kinds of patterns that we see in no match.
I understand, but you did not offer the court statewide a number of records on on Professor Quinn's no match list that you allege to be false negatives, correct?
Again, in terms of the additional DMV matching, I provided counts of individuals and the racial composition of those counts.
I understand, and we'll talk more about that. That's one specific category. I'm trying to understand, at the end of the day, you did not tell the court how many of Dr. Quinn's no matches in total were erroneous, correct?
No, because I do not have all of the ID information such as military IDs, veterans IDs, local government employee IDs that could have an impact.
Okay.
The answer to your question is no, because I didn't have the data to do so.
Okay. Dr. Thornton, I want to talk to you now about some of the, in your report, critiques you have of Professor Quinn for missing data. You can turn to your report, the hard copy that you have there. In paragraph 34 on page 15 of your report. Ashley, maybe it would be helpful if we pulled up Joint Exhibit 800 so the court could read along. In page 34 on paragraph 15, you state that Professor Quinn does not, in your words, consider or take into account the requirement of county boards of elections to issue without charge voter photo identification cards upon the request of registered voters. Do you see that?
Yes.
You are aware that Professor Quinn received data on all of the 2,337 free IDs issued by the County Board of Elections and incorporated that into his matching analysis, aren't you?
Yes, I think this sentence is a different point.
It is not accurate to state that Professor Quinn does, quote unquote, not consider or take into account this form of qualifying ID, is it?
I think when you read the entirety of the section, it puts it into context as to what this sentence means. So in context of this section, it is accurate.
It is not accurate with respect to the free IDs issued that Professor Quinn incorporated into his no match analysis, correct?
That's different from what this section is describing.
I understand, and we will get into the rest of that section, but Dr. Thornton, just simply put, you acknowledge, don't you, that Dr. Quinn did take into account in his analysis and factored in the issuance of quote unquote free IDs, 2,337 of them, right?
To the extent he had that information.
He did have that information. Are you unaware?
Yes,
You were unaware that he had information about the 2,337 voters for whom free ID had been issued?
again, I believe perhaps I'm not being clear. What I'm referring to here is different.
I understand, Dr. Thornton, and we're going to get into this paragraph, but I want to make sure for the court and for the record that you understand that this sentence would not be applicable to the extent that Dr. Quinn did incorporate IDs issued by County Board of Elections into his no match. Isn't that true?
To the extent that he incorporated those, it is accurate to those, he would have had that information, but to the larger question of what I'm stating, it is not correct.
All right. Well, let's look at what your larger point is. You continue in that paragraph that registered voters may obtain these voter IDs during in-person early voting and do not have to make a separate trip or go to a different location to obtain the ID as the County Board of Elections or a site reasonably proximate thereto are required one-stop sites. Do you see that?
Yes,
You understand, don't you, that not every early voting site in North Carolina is required to offer so-called free IDs, right?
that is correct.
And you didn't do any analysis to determine how many voters in North Carolina used one-stop voting sites where free ID would actually be available, did you?
That is correct. I described that in my report.
Okay. In fact, you haven't performed any analysis on how many early voting sites would offer free IDs in the future, have you?
No, that's not known.
Okay. And then I assume it follows, but you didn't do any analysis to show which counties in 2018 had any satellite early voting sites at all at which voters could even potentially obtain free IDs. Did you?
What year?
2018?
I do not know.
You didn't do that analysis?
No,
And so you don't know.
I don't know. I don't know quite how I would have identified those.
Okay. I'd like to now publish, excuse me, publish to the court what's been marked as Plaintiff's Demonstrative Exhibit 6-2. Dr. Thornton, I'll represent to you that this is a map of the counties across North Carolina without a satellite one-stop voting site in 2018. And it also shows the Black voting age population percentage for each of those counties. Since you didn't do any analysis on this topic, you'd have no basis to dispute that numerous counties across the state only had one early voting site in 2018, correct?
There are some here in yellow without a one-stop voting site. If you're asking me to count them, I can count them. I don't know how many offhand.
No, my question is that since you didn't do this analysis, you have no basis to dispute that numerous counties across the state had no satellite one-stop early voting sites, correct?
If this is accurate, there would be some without a one-stop.
Some without a satellite one-stop, correct?
Without a satellite one-stop.
Right. And you'd have no basis to dispute that many of these counties without satellite early voting sites are heavily Black, would you?
I would only have to go by what you have here.
Because you didn't do any independent analysis, correct?
No, and my understanding was that, and maybe I'm incorrect, but that because of the lawsuit, my understanding is that we really have limited data to begin with with regard to the voter ID.
Ashley, you can take that down now. Dr. Thornton, if you want to go back to your report, and Ashley, if you want to put up Joint Exhibit 800 again, going to paragraph 36. You conclude that because Black voters are more likely to cast their ballot during one-stop early voting than any other group, they are more likely to obtain a free voter ID than other voters without acceptable ID. Do you see that?
Yes,
Did you perform any analysis on whether Black voters use one-stop sites where free IDs are offered as opposed to the CBOE office where they are mandated to be offered?
I haven't done that analysis.
And you'd agree with me that if a voter, white or Black, went to an early voting site that did not offer a quote unquote free ID, that voter wouldn't be saved an extra trip, correct?
That is correct.
And same thing, you didn't perform any analysis for voters on Professor Quinn's no match list that would allow you to know whether they were voting at an early voting site where it would even be possible to obtain a free ID, correct?
Yes, if you're asking me if I've looked at that question, no. And as I testified with the law enjoined, I don't know how helpful that exercise would be.
You understand though that there's talking about Black voters disproportionately using early voting sites does not affect their ability to get a county board issued ID if that early voting site doesn't offer that ID, correct?
That if that site doesn't offer it, but perhaps one would choose a different site if the law had not been enjoined. So looking at something today and something couldn't happen, I don't know how useful that is. What we do know is that African American voters were more likely to vote.
And we do know that Senate Bill 824 does not mandate that county boards of elections issue free IDs at every early voting site. Isn't that true?
That is correct, as I state in my report.
Thank you. You don't have any evidence that suggests that African American voters are aware of what you describe as the availability of free voter ID. Isn't that true?
I don't know.
You agree that it's possible that voters without qualifying ID may be discouraged from presenting to vote based on their understanding that they need qualifying ID to do so, right?
It's possible.
I want to turn now to paragraph 44 on page 21 of your report. Again, this is Joint Exhibit 800, where you were talking in your report and you talked with Mr. Patterson on direct about missing driver's license number and last four of the social security number. And looking at paragraph 44 on page 21, you critique Professor Quinn's analysis on the grounds that some of the records in the voter registration file miss data such as social security number or driver's license number, correct?
Yes,
It's possible, isn't it, that people lacking a driver's license number in the voter registration file simply do not have a driver's license?
it is possible. We also know that the voter registration file did not always collect driver's license numbers. So consequently, we do not know, but some are missing.
You'd of course agree that if an individual did not have a driver's license, they would not put a driver's license number on their voter registration application and it wouldn't be in the voter file, correct?
That's one explanation, yes.
I'd like to just publish what's been marked as PDX 6-3. This is a recreation of table 2 in the expert report of Professor Quinn, showing his 11 composite matching fields. Dr. Thornton, out of Professor Quinn's 11 match strings, only one relied on driver's license numbers. Isn't that correct?
Yes,
Okay. And can we go to PDX 6-5? Dr. Thornton, so the remaining 10 strings would still result in matches, correct?
if done properly, yes.
And those fields for the remaining 10 strings are represented on this demonstrative?
I believe so.
Okay. Matching on these composite strings may occur on a variety of fields, including name, birth date, last four social, and address fields, correct?
Sure.
Okay. If we can go then to PDX 6-4, you also pointed out that some of the files that you looked at were missing the last 4 digits of the Social Security number, correct?
Yes.
Professor Quinn also used various strings that did not rely at all on Social Security number, correct?
Yes, but I should point out on both this demonstrative and your prior demonstrative, you're making, in your example, the data look very nice and clean in terms of those fields. And so it will look as though it will easily match. In reality, driver's license is a nice, clean field to match on as a social. These others are not necessarily so. In this demonstrative, certainly they look nice. Clean. That's not the reality of the
I'm
data.
sorry, Dr. Thornton, you broke up. In this demonstrative, certainly they look nice, and I couldn't hear the rest.
In this demonstrative, as well as the prior one, the data appear to be clean. That is, they will easily match. But in reality, in terms of the driver's license data and in the voter registration data, these other fields will not cleanly match in every instance.
I understand, Dr. Thornton, and aside from your not enjoying our demonstrative name intended to secure the privacy of voters implicated by this match, if a voter was missing the last 4 of the Social Security number, Professor Quinn could still match them on 5 strings as shown in this demonstrative, correct?
Based on that demonstrative, yes.
So when you testified earlier on direct that the missing driver's license number and Social Security number would increase the likelihood of a no match, That was a false assertion because as we just reviewed, records missing that data could be matched on a number of other strings. Isn't that right?
The way in which you characterize my testimony as being false, because what I testified is absolutely correct. As I testified, if you have data, the no matches will increase. Looking at these fields and working with these data, you're more likely to have a no match if you're relying on these other fields. Right?
I'm sorry, Ms. Riggs, I couldn't understand.
You broke up.
You're gonna need to repeat. As I testified, if you have data, the no matches will increase, and I don't think that's correct as far as what I heard. So if you could repeat your answer, please.
Yes. I disagree with the statement. I testified to earlier is correct that if you
Dr.
are
Thornton, Dr. Thornton, let me just stop you right there. You've broken up again, and it may be your internet connection. I'm not really sure. It may be how far away you are from the microphone. I'm not sure about that, but do you know if there's anyone? Are you on a hard line or are you using Wi-Fi for your computer?
I'm at the office and I'm plugged in, beyond that, not an IT person. I have not had this problem previously. This is the first time I've ever had this problem.
Your Honor, if I may interject, I have an idea. I've been noticing when the microphones get picked up because there's an indicator blue that goes around the box of the person who's talking. And I think that Ms. Riggs's microphone is particularly sensitive. So it picks up every movement she makes. So it then breaks into the witness's statements. So I don't know if there's a way to lower the volume on Ms. Riggs's microphone, but that might address it as well.
I didn't see that, Mr. Cox, but thank you for that. Ms. Riggs, perhaps you could move, if you can't lower the microphone, maybe you could move it a little further away from you.
I'm happy to do that. I think Miss Fawcett likes my volume, but I will try to move away. How is that better? Am I quieter?
Not much, no.
I'll try to mute when Dr. Thornton's answering. How about that?
Well, that may be very onerous on your part, to try to mute and then unmute each time you ask a question, but that may be what's happening. I don't know, but is there a way to move it away a little further?
I can try that, but I'm also happy to make the extra effort. It's not onerous at all.
Well, we'll go forward and try, and maybe we just try something new and see how it works. But I'm having a hard time hearing what you're saying as well, Dr. Thornton. And it's just because your voice is just choppy. I mean, it's almost like you're on a cell phone and you've got bad reception. We've all experienced that, but that's kind of what it sounds like. Is sort of like you're going through a valley while you're talking on the phone or something like that. But maybe we'll work through it here. Let's try to give it another go.
Yes, and I apologize, Your Honor. I haven't had this difficulty before.
Okay.
So I will try my best.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I don't know where we left off. Ms. Fawcett, do you want to direct us?
Sure. Okay. I disagree with the way in which you characterize my testimony as being false, because what I testified is absolutely correct. As I've testified, if you have data, the no matches will increase, which I think I misheard, to be honest, because she blipped there. Looking at these fields and working with these data, you're more likely to have a no match if you're, and then it broke up completely.
If you have data that are missing, such as the last 4 digits of the SSN, and the driver's license that are missing, you will increase the no match rate. These other fields, just because they're populated, will not necessarily mean that you will have a match.
Dr. Thornton, I want to make sure I got your direct right. I wrote, and I think I got it correctly, that the missing driver's license number and social security number would increase the likelihood of a no match. Did I get that correct?
Yes,
And if I understand correctly, your testimony is that somehow that has to do with those being more unique identifiers. Is that right?
it's more than that.
You mentioned earlier in your testimony that Dr. Quinn's strings, which connect different pieces of data, had a high level of uniqueness in creating a unique identifier. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And we've now reviewed that with the strings that Dr. Quinn utilized that don't include driver's license or social security number, there are multiple strings that create highly unique identifiers via the string and don't rely on driver's license or social security at all, correct?
There may be multiple unique strings, but they would be unique to the driver's license data and unique to the voter registration file. And the way in which those data are, they would not necessarily match. Sometimes they will match, but other times they will not match because they have differences between the two. So it's the same person, but they will not nicely match. Just as, for example, the way an address is entered. We can all think of different ways in which addresses are entered, and you will then have a different, they may not match.
Dr. Thornton, you testified that, for example, string 3 that Dr. Quinn used, which utilizes only first name, last name, and date of birth, has a high level of uniqueness as far as creating a unique identifier, didn't you?
Yes, and I think you're mischaracterizing my testimony. Being unique, right, doesn't mean that you will then have a unique, it will actually match. Being unique to a file, one file, and being unique to another file will not necessarily mean that they will match. And the question is, among the 480,000 that didn't match, if there had been social filled in and if there had been driver's license number filled in, would they have been matched? That's the question.
I understand, but you also understand that in records lacking driver's license numbers, using Dr. Quinn's analysis, there were 10 other chances, 10 other strings for those voters to match, correct?
There were 10 other possibilities, actually not 10 other possibilities, because he had 11 matches. 7 of the 11 included either the social or the driver's license, which means that there were only 4 that had combinations that did not include either the driver's license or the social security number.
Okay, there were 11 that didn't, there were 10 that didn't include driver's license, there were 5 that didn't include social, and you're saying there are 4 that included neither, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so there were 4 additional chances for those voters to match even without driver's license or social. Isn't that right?
There are 4, but then you're looking at these other fields that do not match as cleanly.
Dr. Thornton, let's take a look at your table 8. JX 800, it's at page 22. This table reports percentages of voters on Professor Quinn's no match that lack these 2 data points compared to the percentage of voters on the entire voter roll who lack them, correct?
Among active and inactive voters.
Okay, and you report certain groups, age 18 to 25, age 66 and older, women and African American voters in this table, correct?
Yes,
But you do not include white voters here, do you?
that's correct.
You had the data to include white voters, didn't you?
I could have. But these are the groups that I thought were of interest.
So this table doesn't tell us whether African Americans on the no match list are more or less likely to lack these data in the voter file than white voters, does it?
This table specifically, no, my recollection is it's lower for whites.
It's not in your report, is it?
No,
Okay. Similarly, this table, table 8, doesn't report the percentage of white voters who are missing. Well, I think, let me just strike that and rephrase this. Table 8 and your report doesn't tell us whether all registered Black voters are more likely to be missing driver's license numbers and last 4 of social than all white registered voters, does it?
it doesn't. It doesn't address that specific question. I was comparing African American to the overall, and African American to the overall it's higher among African Americans.
Well, and this is just among no match lists, not overall registered voters, is it?
It shows both.
Oh, at the bottom. Okay, thank you. All right, I'd like to turn to paragraph 23 in your report. At paragraph 23, you state that Professor Quinn's no match list includes voters with student addresses registered to vote decades ago, correct?
You said paragraph 23?
Yes, it's on your screen too.
I see it.
And do you see that you state that Professor Quinn's no match list includes voters with student addresses registered to vote decades ago? Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yeah.
And your suggestion is thus that an individual may no longer live in North Carolina and thus would be ineligible to vote. Is that right?
Yes, or alternatively, they've moved or have a name change and therefore not likely to have a match.
Okay. And when you say student address, you're referring to voters with registration addresses near a college or university, right?
No, at a university.
Do you remember how you define student address in your report?
as how it was, I defined it is in among the 480,000 no matches, the address was that of the university, or it actually state the dorm.
Okay, and I'm asking you a different question. I'm asking, in your report, do you define what you classified as a student address?
As student address, I would assume that people would have understood it as I just described.
Okay, but you didn't define it for the reader.
I didn't think it was necessary.
Okay. And do you recall in your deposition, we talked about how sometimes faculty can live on campus?
It's a possibility, yes.
Okay. And school staff could live on campus, isn't that right?
It's a possibility, yes.
You didn't investigate whether any of these registered voters with what you have identified as student addresses but not defined were actually students before making this claim, did you?
No, it was based upon looking at thousands of entries among the 480,000.
And are you aware that on the campus of Wake Forest University, there are numerous houses considered on-campus housing that are private residences?
No, the Wake Forest, they all had, as I recall, the same address.
You could have reached out and confirmed with a university whether the address listed was one in which only students could live, couldn't you have?
One could have, however, as I said, there were, I looked at the websites for some of the schools and the dorms were those of dormitories.
Okay. In your report, you didn't actually identify any voters on Professor Quinn's no match list that were ineligible student voters, did you?
No, I identified those who were potentially.
Sitting here today, you cannot provide the court with any specific records on Professor Quinn's no match list that are ineligible to vote based on their student address registration. Isn't that true?
No, if the court asked me to provide a list of those who have a higher probability, I could certainly do that.
But you didn't in your report.
No, I did not.
Okay. And for this claim that Professor Quinn's analysis includes student addresses where you suspect those students may not be able to vote, you didn't quantify the number of no match voters fitting your criteria in your report, did you?
I did not.
And in your report, you didn't measure the racial disparity, if any, of records falling into this category, did you?
I did not.
And you did not provide Professor Quinn or plaintiffs with a list of records meeting this new criteria for testing at the time you submitted your report, correct?
I do not believe so.
So in reading your report, there's no way for the court to discern how many voters this criteria applies to. Isn't that right?
Now, my point is that there are individuals among the 480,000 who have who are inactive voters, a school address, and they registered many years ago.
I understand, but you can't give this court a number, correct?
That is correct.
All right, now if we can turn to paragraph 43 in your report. You write that the percentage female on Professor Quinn's no match list is higher than the percentage among registered voters. Do you see that?
Yes,
The percentage difference you're referring to is 1.28 percentage points, right?
that's correct.
And you don't report that percentage in your report, do you?
One can do the arithmetic from table 7.
Okay, you did not report the 1.2 percentage in what, sorry, 1.28 percentage in your report, did you?
No, one can do the simple arithmetic.
And I suppose if wanted to further that arithmetic, that difference that you're calling out represents only 2,976 voters on the no match list. Isn't that correct?
That would be approximately correct.
Out of more than 480,000.
Yes, still not inconsequential though.
You could have reported this number in your report, but you didn't, right?
I did not see the need to.
You just concluded that females were disproportionately represented on the no match list, right?
They are. And even though, as you state, you do the 2%, that you apply the 1%. It's not just that there's this disproportionate number. Among the 480,000, you could have many more name changes. Obviously so, but we do not have those DMV data.
Okay, we'll get to that, Professor Thornton. Sorry, Dr. Thornton. In your table 7, you present that more than 61,000 records on the no match list are not identified by gender at all. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And it is entirely possible that the 2,976 difference in voters could be explained by these 61,000 records without gender identification, isn't it?
If you're saying that the difference could be, it's possible it doesn't address the question of having name change data available for the matching.
I understand it, and we're going to get to that. But
Putting aside the differences we have, it doesn't address name changes.
I understand, Dr. Thornton, and I am going to discuss name changes with you, but you agree with me, don't you, that it's entirely possible that the 2,976 difference in voters could be explained by the 61,000 records without gender identification, correct?
Well, is it possible? It's possible, but we don't know.
Right, and you didn't share this
It doesn't address the bigger question, but I did report the number without gender.
Instead, you reached the conclusion because of this 2,976 difference, Professor Quinn was more likely to miss women in his matching analysis because they changed their names at a higher rate. That was your conclusion, correct?
That certainly is the case. We do not have the DMV name change data.
Looking at table 7 in your report, you didn't break down the gender composition of the no match list by race. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
Sitting here today, you have no basis to conclude that the values reported in table 7 of your report affect Professor Quinn's conclusions on the racial disparity in ID possession, right?
I don't know what the racial effect is. Does it impact the matching? Certainly.
And you can't point to any analysis in your report suggesting that African-American women are more likely to change their name after marriage than white women, correct?
That's not a question I addressed.
All right, so on this name change, I want to display a demonstrative marked PDX 6-6. And I want to, all right. So I want to ask you some questions about a hypothetical last name change, Dr. Thornton. You'd agree with me, wouldn't you, that not all of Professor Quinn's match strings relied on last name?
That's correct.
And Professor Quinn's matching analysis was structured so that in order to find a match, only one of his 11 matching strings needed to match to keep a voter off the no match list, correct?
That is correct.
And so if a voter were to marry and change their last name, Professor Quinn would still find a match between their voter file record and qualifying ID record if both of those records still had that individual's former name. Isn't that right?
Yes, but of the 11 composite matches, all but 2 rely on some form of the last name for a match.
Okay, let me ask a few more questions on this demonstrative. So likewise, if both databases, the voter file and the qualifying ID record, both had updated last names, then in the matching analysis, those records would still match, correct?
Depends on what was updated.
Okay. So the concern you express requires the last name change to have only been updated in either the voter file or the qualifying ID databases, correct?
You have to assume that both were updated simultaneously.
I don't think that was quite the question I was asking. The only place where it's problematic is if one but not the other is updated. Isn't that right?
Yes, yes. I mean, if one is updated and the other's not, it doesn't matter which one.
Right. But if
Well,
neither are updated or both are updated, it's a non-issue. Isn't that right?
assuming that it's entered correctly.
Okay. And you haven't reported any analysis in your report on the likelihood of one, the voter file being updated, but not the qualifying ID file being updated, correct?
Well, I don't believe I have enough information to know that, to test that.
So you haven't done that analysis, correct?
Well, no, because I do not believe I have the necessary information to do that.
Okay. So looking at this hypothetical last name change demonstrative, you would agree that Professor Quinn's strings 1 and 11 do not use any form of last name, correct?
No, but then they rely on having driver's license populated and social security number. And we know among the no matches, they're more likely to be missing both one or both of those.
You don't know, you don't have any basis sitting here today to suggest that women changing their last names are amongst the women missing driver's license and social security together.
What I can see from table 8 is that 48.85% of the women on the no match list are missing either the social security number or the driver's license number.
But you have no basis to estimate or inform the court as to how many of those women are changing their last names or have changed their last names. Isn't that right?
Well, no, I don't know how I would know that when I do not have the data to test that question. We do not have the DMV name change data.
Just last question on this demonstrative, Dr. Thornton. These strings would still find a match in this hypothetical where a last name was changed and only updated in one of the databases. Isn't that correct?
In your hypothetical where both the driver's license number and the social security number are populated, this would presumably have a match.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Thornton. I'd now like to turn to paragraph 48 of your report. Ashley, if you could put that up. Dr. Quinn, Dr. Thornton, you argue that Professor Quinn could have reviewed the no match list and matched records where birthday is slightly different between databases, but the names are the same. Is that right?
Yes, he could have prepared a electronic match to identify them and then review.
You'd agree with me, wouldn't you, that there are voters in North Carolina with the same name but slightly different birth dates, wouldn't you?
Yes, I'm describing among the no matches, which is a smaller subset.
Okay, and I'm correct that you didn't define what you mean by slightly different birth dates in your report, did you?
No, I would assume that folks would know what a slightly different birth date would be.
Well, I don't know what that means. Does it mean off by 3 days or 4 days?
Means you're off by a few years, or it's the exact same year, month and day, but you're off by a year or two.
Okay, and that is not in your report, am I right?
Right. I
Okay,
would say that is a slight difference.
okay. Let's display plaintiff's demonstrative 6-3. Again, the recreated table 2 from Dr. Quinn's report. Professor Quinn didn't rely on birth date for all of his match strings, correct?
That's correct.
So he would still identify matches in situations where either a voter record or qualifying ID record had a typographical error in date of birth, right?
As long as the other information was clean and could be matched on, and I believe I've testified now at length about the issues of missing data or incorrect data.
Mm-hmm. And he would still identify matches in situations where the voter record and the qualifying ID record had a quote unquote slight difference in birth date. Isn't that right?
If you're asking me if there were other strings that could have been matched on as long as they were clean and populated, that's possible. But I think I've already testified at length about those issues.
You didn't identify any voter record files in your report that you believe are erroneously on Professor Quinn's no match list because of a slight difference in birth date, did you?
Now, I identified individuals when I was reviewing them.
Your report doesn't say how many records you believe to have slightly different birth dates, does it?
No, I did not quantify them.
And you agree that you did not perform a systematic review of records based on this new criteria, right?
No, as I stated, I identified them upon looking at the no matches,
Right, not systematically.
not with regards to birth date.
All right, Dr. Thornton, if you'll turn now to page 49 in your report, you can feel free to look at your hard copy. And Ashley, if you'll put JX 800, paragraph 49, it's page 24 up. Thank you. Dr. Thornton, here you criticize Professor Quinn for using the Soundex matching method in 3 of his 11 match strings, correct?
I believe that mischaracterizes the way in which what I've written here.
You say Soundex is not a reliable method for non-standard names. Is that right?
Yes, so that's why I'm saying I'm not criticizing the use of Soundex. I'm stating that Soundex has its limitations.
Soundex, first, Professor Quinn only employs the Soundex method in 3 of his match strings, right?
That is correct.
And a match on any of Professor Quinn's other 8 strings would be counted as having qualifying ID, regardless of this Soundex issue, correct?
Yes, and as I testified before, as long as, for example, you do not have a typographical error or a field is not populated. And so it's the additive nature. We know that social is missing for a large number, driver's license is missing for a large number. And then the others have can have error in entry or differences in entry.
In this paragraph, footnote 33, you cite to a paper on the Soundex method authored by Patman and Schaefer, correct?
Yes.
That paper relies on 2 different studies to form its conclusions. Is that right?
Yes, as I recall.
And one of those studies measures the effectiveness of Soundex based on names in the 1851 census. Isn't that right?
I believe so.
And the other study found that of the 4 methods tested, Soundex was the most effective. Isn't that correct?
Yes, keeping in mind that it has still a low return rate amongst those. And there are other methods that make.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the end of your answer.
So of the 4 that were tested, as I recall, while Soundex may have been the best of those 4, the return rate was still below 40%. So that means there's still a very high error rate. And you know, other methods are still being tested with regards to the method used. But regardless, Soundex not reliable for non-standard names.
So on that point, sorry, I'm trying to toggle between mute and unmute. So on that point, you argue that there are limitations in Soundex's ability to deal with, I believe you refer to them as non-English or non-traditional names, but you don't quantify how many records are affected by this limitation. Isn't that right?
That's That's correct. I'm stating what we know about Soundex.
And so you didn't perform any analysis to determine how many names may be implicated on Professor Quinn's no match list, correct?
I did not quantify it.
Dr. Thornton, in your report, I understood that you critiqued Professor Quinn's no match analysis because you identified 44 voters on that list that you believe to be deceased. Is that correct?
That's one of my criticisms, yes.
Okay, and in Professor Quinn's report, Ashley, you can take down what's on the screen right now. In Professor Quinn's report, he explains that he removed voters from the voter file if they appeared on the DHHS death file. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
And he also described that he removed records from the DMV license status code B, representing that the individual is deceased, right?
That's what he stated.
Okay. And do you understand that DHHS is the only state agency in North Carolina that keeps a death file?
I would think so.
And that DMV gets its data from DHHS?
I don't know that one way or another.
And you don't know if you ran the code using the DMV file and found an additional, you claimed 44 deceased voters, is that correct?
I need to double check my report as to the number. Yes, 44.
And do you remember, I don't think this is in your report, but do you remember discussing with me at your deposition that amongst these, they were no matches with the driver's license populated?
If you're asking me, I do not recall the exact question you asked me at my deposition. Were the 44 in the DMV data? Yes.
Okay. Is it possible that those 44 records could be explained by DMV data recording errors?
It's possible.
And in your report, you did not provide the racial breakdown of these 44 records, did you?
Actually, at the top of page 27, I state that 19 of the 44 were African American.
Let me stop you right there. It's now 3:30. This is time for our normal afternoon break. So we're going to go ahead and break for about 15 minutes at this point. We'll come back on at 3:45. All right. So